Okay, so let's go look inside the front of the car to see how to get the instrument panel out and what we did there. Okay, so to remove the instrument panel on this car, there's going to be this part right here. It's going to go underneath here. It's going to have one screw right where this hole here is. There's also going to be this part here. It snaps into here. You just pry it out with a flathead screwdriver. Then there's two screws in here that go up into the dash, and there's two screws up here that go up into the dash. When you take those all out, there's also two nuts up under here and a little bracket, and let's see where that bracket is laying. This bracket here goes under there. Take those two nuts out. That lets the steering column fall down a little bit. That makes it easier to get this out. When you pull this out, this can be a little bit of a booger to pull out, but they do just pull right out. And then in the back, you're going to have a speedometer cable, probably will be the first thing to remove. It's in the middle, and there's kind of a big nut there and a thicker cable. You can reach up from the back and get that if you can't get this far enough out, or you can pull this out and you can reach in and unscrew that, and then you can pull this out a little further. When you have this down, you want to take some emery cloth, and on the back of both the fuel gauge, there's two terminals, and the temperature gauge looks just like this. I have two terminals on the back. You're going to want to take the emery cloth and spin it around here and get these nice and shiny and clean, because the wire connectors for those, whoops, this was a bad gauge, fortunately. These are very fragile too, by the way, so you don't want to be throwing them around if it's good. Okay, so the back of these terminals, how these things just push on here like that, okay? The problem with that is if everything's nice and clean, it works great. If it's not nice and clean because it's old, then what's going to happen is when you go pushing this back into the dash, this will wiggle a little bit and you'll get an unreliable connection, and your gauge is working one minute and not working another. You go over a bump or railroad tracks or something and your gauge quits working and you don't know why. You reach under the dash and kind of move some wires around, and all of a sudden the thing starts working. This is a definite thing that can happen that can cause that. So generally, if you do what I said, wire brush these terminals, then these will just push on there nice and you'll never have a problem. Another good idea while you have this out, check all the lights. Make sure that all your lights work. If they don't, the bulbs that are in here, you just wiggle these and pull them out, and you can get the bulb to just push in and turn out. Change the bulbs, get yourself some new bulbs if they're not working. That way your high beam indicator and all those things can be working. You can see your gauges at night. On this particular car, I don't know if you can see it from that far away, but on the back of the instrument panel, they've numbered each of these terminals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 on across, and then you can see that they put tape on each of the wire connectors and numbered the tape as well. So it's real convenient if you're ever working on this and one of the wires just falls off or whatnot. Okay, so for testing, you're going to use a couple of possibilities here. One, a meter like this. This is a multimeter. It's set in the ohms. So we're basically just checking to see if there's a connection between one wire and another wire. You see at the bottom it says OL. If there's a connection between the two wires, so we take this and touch these two together, you can see that this changes and becomes almost zero. That means there's no resistance. We're measuring resistance when we're checking for continuity this way. So we can check the gauge for resistance by just putting one of these on the back of each terminal. This will tell us if the gauge has a connection between one side and the other. It should read about 88 ohms. It's not critical that it reads 88. It could be 82 or something like that. Bottom line to it is, from manufacturer to manufacturer, that's going to vary. So we're not really so worried about that as much as we would be if you put the ohm meter on this and you connect to each side and it's open, it says OL on it, then that means that one of these two coils in the back of here probably has one of the wires broke or burned up on it, and this gauge is probably never going to work if there's an open line or open on this. Okay, another thing that you can do with this meter, you can test the wire from the fuel gauge back to the sender and make sure that that wire is good. How I do that is I'll just grab myself a big long piece of wire, strip both ends of the wire, connect one to that little wire that I took off of the fuel sender unit, and then bring the other one up here on the outside of the car. I'll connect my meter up. One I'll connect right onto that wire that I just ran along the outside of the car, and the other I'll connect here. And what I'm doing is I'm taking a reading on this wire all the way back to the fuel tank. If I get an OL on that, that means that wire is broke between here and there. And in this car, that's what we found, one of the problems. There was an open between there and the tank. So the gauge is never going to read if the wire's cut somewhere in between or something's unplugged or something like that. Okay, so in the case of this car, like I said, the wire between here and there didn't work. So the next thing I did to try to figure out why it didn't work was, instead of testing from the end to here, now I'm trying to test somewhere around underneath the dash to figure out where that wire is broke. So how the wiring on this car works is, in the back of the car, so from somewhere right under here to the left of where your foot would be, there's only about 5 wires that go to the whole back of the car. One of them would go to left turn, one would go right turn, one would go to tail light, and then you've got the fuel sender, and then you've got a dome light wire. So you're looking for a wire harness that goes under the carpet and runs along back to the back of the car. So what I did on this car was I tested from the sending unit connection, the wire that went right onto the sending unit. I put my extra wire outside of the car up here so that I could have room and work with both of the wires right by me. So I connected one end to the one lead on my tester, one end on the other lead of my tester, and in that case I'm using the yellow multimeter. And then I'm taking that set of 5 wires and I'm poking each one of them except for the hot one, the orange one, because I already knew which one that was. That was the dome light one. The other ones I wasn't really sure which one was, so I'm testing each of those wires. And I found one wire that went to the back of the car that was under the dash that was unplugged. Okay, so in this case I plugged that in and then I retested. Do I have now a connection from there to here? So again, I took my little wire that was running on the outside, hooked my meter up to one side of it, hooked the meter up to here. I still have a broken wire or no connection. My meter still read OL. So at that point, I'm looking at where the wiring goes. It goes off into the dash. It goes into some taped up wires that go into another branch that's all taped up. And I know where it goes and where it comes out, but to chase it down inside of that harness and figure out where it's broke, or whether there's maybe a connector like this where you've got a wire in on each side and somebody didn't squeeze it good and it got corroded and now it's not making a contact. I have no idea where it is inside there, and I have no desire to tear all that apart to find it. It's much easier to just put another wire on here and run a short piece of wire maybe 2 feet long, maybe 18 inches long, whatever you need, down to the one wire that I already found that I knew goes to the back. That wire from there back to the fuel gauge was good. My problem was just up here. I fixed that with a jumper wire, adding a wire, hook it all up. Now I'm good on my fuel gauge to the back. My fuel gauge has power when I turn the key on. It has 12 volts to one side. My terminals are clean. My gauge is working. I'm like, cool, I'm golden. Put the thing back in, shut the key off, turn the key back on. It doesn't work. Like, what? Pull it out, start messing with it again, turn the key on, put the wire on, it works. Back and forth, it was working and it wasn't working. Then I figured out I can tap on the instrument cluster and the gauge starts working. So the gauge wasn't working unless you tapped on the instrument cluster. I ended up pulling the gauge out of here, changing the gauge, putting in one of the gauges out of one of those other instrument clusters that I had. Now everything's good. Got the gauge working, gauge works reliable. Shut the key off, turn the key on. Every time it comes back to the same place, doesn't skip a beat. All my terminals are clean, my wire's solid all the way back, my sender's good. Okay, one other thing I need to cover with you. The fuel gauge has to be grounded. If you look at the gauge, these terminals are insulated through this metal because this metal is grounded. But there's also a ground in the back inside of here that has to have a contact here. If that doesn't have a contact, the gauge won't work. If this is installed in the back of this instrument panel and this isn't grounded, the gauge won't work. So when you're testing this, you may need to take a jumper wire. And what I was doing was hooking up one of the jumpers to the instrument cluster like this to give it a ground, and I was just grounding it to the shifter column. Okay, so when we turn the key on, don't know if you can see it from the camera, but the gauge will read now. Okay, it's reading just under a quarter of a tank. Okay, so another thing, this gauge, I'll show you here. If we disconnect the wire going to the fuel sender, this is kind of a quick way to check this gauge. If you turn the key on, the gauge should peg all the way if it's working correctly. Okay, not all manufacturers will do that. Sometimes the gauge is parked on E, meaning when the key's off, it's going to just sit all the way on E. When you turn the key on, instead of pegging all the way to full, it'll peg all the way to E. So maybe you won't even see it move at all, or you'll just barely see it move a little, but it'll stay on E when this wire's disconnected. And that's how those work. Some of them work one way, some work the other way. They all pretty much use the same type of method for the sending unit where it's interrupting the ground, making the ground worse or stronger, but they use a different range. Like one may be 0 to 30 ohms, one might be 30 to 60. So the fuel sending unit may not measure the same if you're going to test it. So that's why I told you earlier that it's really not that critical what it tests at. As long as it has resistance, that's the important thing, unless you know for sure that it's supposed to be 30 to 60. If you know for sure the resistance, then great, you can test it for that and make sure that it falls within that range. One other thing I should add is if you change the fuel gauge and you're not using a factory gauge with the factory sending unit, a mismatch of the parts will cause the gauge to be inaccurate. You can use an aftermarket gauge and bolt it down like in the gauge panel. Like, I don't know if you can see these or not on the video, but there's some aftermarket gauges under the dash here. You could use an aftermarket fuel gauge, but the sending unit and the gauge have to match each other. So if the gauge is one that pegs when it's got a full ground all the way to E, but yet your sender is made the opposite way, then your gauge is going to read backwards. So when your tank is full, it's going to read empty. When it's empty, it's going to read full. So you have to make sure that the parts match each other. Okay, so let's reiterate what the possibilities are of problems. One, the fuel sending unit that goes in the tank could be open circuited, broken, or whatnot, so it doesn't read. Two, the ground could be bad on that sending unit. So the connection between where the bolts bolt the sending device into the tank, maybe our screws aren't getting a good connection and don't have a good ground. You can fix that by just adding an external wire to ground. That's not a big deal. It's not a problem to add that. Another problem you could have is the wire between the sending unit and the gauge may have been cut, unplugged, have a bad connector, a bad connection somewhere. So you'll need to check for that. Another could be connections at the back of the gauge. Another could be the gauge itself doesn't have a ground. Another issue could be the gauge itself is bad. And the last issue would be the ignition switch is not supplying power to the gauge. And that pretty well sums it up. Okay, so there's one other thing that can trip you up here, and that's on the fuel gauge itself where it goes through this metal plate. If anybody's ever changed the gauge, which just unbolts out of this metal plate, if they've done that and they haven't centered this up perfectly in the holes that are in the metal plate, or one of these insulator pieces on the back is damaged to where there's a connection between this metal plate and these terminals, then one of two things is going to happen. One side of this is going to be where the 12 volts goes to from the ignition switch. Let's see which one that's going to be. That's going to be this one here. Okay, so if the 12 volts is going to here, and this is actually, the insulator is broken behind it, and this nut is touching the metal here, or this is just cocked a little bit in the hole, and the side of where this terminal goes through is touching the side of the hole on this, what's going to happen is either it's going to burn a wire going between the ignition switch and here, or it's going to blow a fuse every time the ignition switch gets turned on because there's a direct short here. On the other side, if this is a fail, where same thing, if this is cocked a little bit and the hole, the side of the hole of this metal plate is touching this stud here, or this insulator underneath is broken and this metal nut is touching the metal plate, then what's going to happen every time you turn the key to on, the gauge is going to go all the way over to empty, assuming the gauge is working properly and assuming you still have 12 volts here. Either way, your fuel gauge is never going to work. I don't care if you have a new sender, brand new wire all the way back, a brand new gauge. You can do everything you want, but if the gauge is not set completely and insulated by these little insulators in this metal, then that's going to trip you out. Okay, so that's going to do it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Share this with a friend if you know someone else who's got an issue like this. Till next time,